Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rachel Snyderman, and I'm an Associate Director of Economic Policy here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual discussion of the Social Security cost of living increase for 2022 and the future of the program. The Social Security Administration announced earlier this morning that Social Security beneficiaries will receive a cost of living adjustment equal to 5.9% of their benefits next year. This morning, we will dive into the implications of this and the future of the program, which comes on the heels of the annual Social Security and Medicare Trustees Report released this past August. I want to thank BPC's Funding Our Future initiative for partnering with us for this event. Funding Our Future is a national coalition of nearly 60 partners across the nonprofit, academic, trade association, and corporate sectors, all dedicated to improving retirement security for Americans. Throughout the conversation this morning, please feel free to participate and submit questions via YouTube's chat function or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan and the hashtag BPCLive. At this time, I would like to introduce Jason Fichner, BPC's Vice President and Chief Economist, who will moderate this morning's discussion and introduce our featured guests. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you everyone for being here today. It is my pleasure to be doing sort of two roles today. One, moderating the discussion, but also being a panelist as well. Quick run of show, I'm going to introduce our two other panelists, and then Steve Goss will go first, Untitled Chapter will speak second, I'll go third, and then we'll take questions from the audience, which is a good time to remind everybody that if you have questions, please submit them using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. So with that, let me first introduce Steve Goss. Steve Goss is the Chief Actuary of the Social Security Administration. Steve has been the Chief Actuary since 2001. He has his undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's in mathematics from the University of Virginia. And quick fun fact, Steve has been with the Social Security Administration for almost as long as I've been alive. Sorry, Steve, I couldn't resist that. Steve is a dear friend. He is a colleague of mine. We work at the Social Security Administration, but he is an expert in this field, and we are pleased to have him. It's a pleasure to have him here today. Chantal Boyens is a Principal Policy Associate of the Income and Benefits Policy Center at the Urban Institute. Her current work focuses on the interactions between Social Security programs and retirement, pension, disability, and paid leave policy. She previously worked at the Office of Management and Budget. She has a master's degree from American University and her bachelor's degree from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, also affectionately known as Cal Poly SLO. So it's a pleasure. Again, these are two experts in Social Security. They're also two dear friends of mine. And with that, Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you for some remarks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jason, and good to see you, Chantal, as well. Great to be with all of you who might be listening and paying attention today. As indicated momentarily ago, yes, the cost of living adjustment was announced this morning because the Bureau of Labor Statistics released the September 2021 CPI. Now, the cost of living adjustment for Social Security is based on the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, the CPIW. The reason for that, of course, is because at the time the automatic cost of living adjustment was first put into law, that was the CPI index. There are others that have been developed since that may be under discussion today, but the CPIW is the index that is utilized. It was there when in the 1970s when the automatic adjustment first came up. The way the adjustment is made now, it applies for benefits that are due to individuals based on their entitlement to Social Security, their eligibility to Social Security, in December of this year and thereafter. It is based on the increase from the third calendar quarter average of the CPIW of 2020 to the third calendar quarter of 2021. The increase, as you all well know now, was 5.9%. That will be applicable for benefits eligible for December this year and next. And this is, by the way, the largest cost of living adjustment that we've had since 1982. Very, very close to the one in 2008, which was 5.8%. Now, I should mention that we do expect that with this relatively large cost of living adjustment, which is close to double what the most recent trustees report had anticipated at 3.1%. That assumption was set some months ago, prior to seeing some of the rises that we've seen in certain sectors that caused the 5.9% COLA. We do expect that additional increase over the 3.1 will be at least partially offset in the coming years by somewhat smaller than otherwise expected COLAs, as some of the elevations in price that we have seen towards the third quarter of this year abate somewhat, and also possibly somewhat higher increases in nominal wages. Each of those would tend to mitigate on Social Security financing. I should also mention that what was also released today, in addition to the cost of living adjustment, is the average wage index. Just as important, if not more so to many, many people, the average wage index is something that we develop at Social Security based on the actual W-2s submitted for the year 2020 by all U.S. wage earners. And the AWI, Average Wage Indexing Series for 2020, is increased 2.8% over the level from 2019. That's significant because individuals becoming newly eligible for benefits in 2022 will have their benefit formula adjusted by that average wage index. Not a surprise to many, but a year or so ago, all were really expecting that the AWI, the Average Wage Indexing Series, would not in fact rise this year, but in fact it did by 2.8%. In addition to the benefits being adjusted for people newly eligible on that basis, there are many other factors like the taxable maximum dollar amount that will be adjusted up to $147,000 for next year. So many, many changes. One thing about the average wage index, it was expected in the 2020 trustees report, where we were not anticipating, we were not including in the estimates in the 2020 trustees report back in April of 2020, that there would be the pandemic and the ensuing recession. And at that time, we were projecting that the average wage index for 2020 would go up by 3.5%, only 0.7% more than it actually went up by the 2.8%. The interesting thing that actually happened in the actual wage reports for 2020 is that we ended up having about 2% fewer workers who worked at any time during the year for at least a day and were paid, but 2.7% less aggregate wages during the year. Many, many factors went into this change, but that's really the primary item. So really quickly, the 2021 trustees report, as hopefully you all are well aware, did incorporate the expected effects of the pandemic and recession, resulting in near-term expectations, much like what we in our Office of the Actuary at Social Security had projected and had put up on the web back in November of 2020, where we did and updated the 2020 trustees report. So the results in the near term were very, very similar. The OESI, Old Age Survivors Insurance, and the combined OESDI trust fund reserve depletion dates were, as we had kind of anticipated, moved 1 year earlier each to 2033 for OESI and to 2034 for the combined OESDI. Several other changes in the trustees report reflecting birth rate projections, labor force and unemployment, and one other item I would mention is we also dropped a reference to the quote unquote budget scoring convention from the OESDI trustees report. As all of you are well aware, Social Security operates on trust funds and it's not really interrelated in any direct way with vis-a-vis its financial or actuarial status with the budget or with the federal debt. So with that, Jason, let me stop and move to Chantel for even more interesting items, I'm sure, and looking forward to your comments and then questions that will ensue.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. Chantel?
Great. Thank you for having me here on the panel today. It's great to see you, Jason and Steve, again. I'm really glad to be talking about COLAs today because it's an opportunity to talk about the value of an often overlooked feature of the Social Security program, and that's the indexation of the benefits. Social Security benefits are essentially an inflation-protected annuity. And so because benefits grow with prices over time, the program aims to protect the buying power of Social Security benefits over time. And this is a feature, this is a benefit that if you tried to buy it on the private market, you would find is really quite costly. And it's really important to think about this because people who are on the program for a long time, including those who are the oldest or those who began receiving benefits due to a disability earlier in life, they're more likely to spend down their assets and become more economically vulnerable as they age. And so indexing the benefit is really important for large parts of the beneficiary population. And so for this reason, sorry for my light, the COLAs get a lot of attention in the policy debate as well. And so I actually took some time to look back over recent Social Security solvency plans that have been put out, including the BPC plan, up through the Democratic candidate proposals that were really detailed, and Representative Larson's plan. And I also looked at a really wonderful analysis done by my colleagues at the Urban Institute, Melissa Favreau, Karen Smith, and Rich Johnson, and they use their Dynasym model to compare these proposals. Their work has a lot to teach us about how to craft proposals that really help achieve key principles like reducing poverty, while also balancing cost concerns. And what I can say from looking at all these plans, almost every plan included either an adjustment to the COLA or provided a benefit boost to long-term beneficiaries, or they did both. So for instance, Sanders, Warren, and Larson all proposed switching to the CPI for the elderly, CPIE, and Johnson and the Bipartisan Policy Center's plan proposed adopting chain CPI. Both of those also want to provide a benefit boost for long-term beneficiaries after 20 years, and so did candidate Biden's plan. The plans that favor adopting the chain CPI, are looking at an argument about whether the methods of calculating the inflation index are the soundest. And a lot of the plans that propose that, they do combine it with the one-time benefit boost, because over time, the chain CPI would result in a reduction that is largest for people receiving benefits the longest. On the other hand, some proposals want to adopt the CPIE, which is an experimental index intended to more closely fit the spending patterns of the elderly. But here, that index is not an exact match to Social Security beneficiary population, and it hasn't been fully studied. And sort of setting aside those arguments about the particular measures, what I really want to highlight is that the analysis done by my colleagues at Urban have a lot to tell us about the impact of these proposals that deal with COLAs. And what they find is that if you care a lot about reducing poverty among the oldest beneficiaries and those who are receiving benefits the longest, again, a lot of disabled beneficiaries, then providing a one-time benefit boost is actually a better option than adopting, for instance, the CPIE. A boost for long-term beneficiaries is both more effective at reducing poverty and it costs less. In fact, it provides more protection against poverty for about half of the price tag. And interestingly, two other provisions that are more effective in combating poverty for older beneficiaries is actually providing a caregiver credit to those with lower earnings who had to take time out of the workforce due to childcare responsibilities. And also, interestingly, reducing the length of a qualifying marriage for spousal and survivor benefits. And these measures are really effective because it reflects the vulnerability largely of women in older age, in retirement, who often receive benefits for a longer period of time. And of course, the best option, if you're looking to craft a proposal that really protects against poverty, is to include a well-designed minimum benefit provision. And here it's really critical to stay well designed because there are a range of solvency options that have been proposed, and they are not all created equal. And what's great about the urban work and work that's actually been done at the Social Security Administration as well is that it's really advanced our knowledge of how to craft these provisions well. And learning from this is really critical because whether you favor shoring up Social Security through taxes or through benefit changes or a mix, and even if you think, well, we can wait and we'll just increase taxes and we'll boost benefits, what we have to understand is that doing that, what that means in that scenario is that we're actually giving up the ability to potentially provide these benefit enhancements that the public say are really important to them by letting time pass by. And similarly, if you don't like tax increases or benefit cuts, it's better to act now to shore up Social Security's financial position. And so, I think it's really, really important to understand the benefit of the COLA. And, this year's COLA is going to make a lot of news, but really this is a core feature of the program that is incredibly important to lots to all beneficiaries, and more so than people often understand, because they, a lot of us don't plan, as well, or aren't able to plan and save the way we'd like to for retirement or for the, in the event of long-term disability. And so I really appreciate the work that Steve's done, to help us understand the dynamics of the program, and Jason, your work at the Bipartisan Policy Center to help us think about options that will make sure that Social Security stays here for us, but also protects people who need it the most.
Thanks, Chantal. I appreciate it. This is a fantastic introduction. I've already have several questions written down based on the conversation, based on COLA, reform proposals, trustees report. So I want to sort of kick right off. And one of the things that always comes out when the COLA announcement is released is, what does this mean for the average beneficiary? And so, Steve, maybe quickly you can talk about what can beneficiaries expect. And of course, the announcements today, when do the benefit increases take place? You're on mute, Steve, sorry.
Yeah, Jason, thank you very much. Well, the cost of living adjustment 5.9% is out there now, and anybody who is currently in receipt of benefit obviously should take a look at what their benefit is and imagine what a roughly 5.9% increase will do to that benefit level. Now, the benefit level for their entitlement, for their eligibility in December of this year, they will actually see the payment for that arrive to them in January. So the increase will actually show up for individuals in their January checks. We should also mention, obviously, also that people who are receiving supplemental security income payments, SSI, that they will also see a similar increase because the same COLA applies to the federal benefit rate that will be payable also starting January of this coming year. The amount by which people will increase, if, for instance, Jason was receiving $3,000 a month and I was receiving $1,000 a month in benefit, then of course the dollar amount of his increase will be 3 times what mine will be. So it really depends on what your base benefit level is. Just increase it by the 5.9%. And again, the SSI recipients, by the way, we have somewhere on the order of what, 65 million Social Security beneficiaries and another 6 or so million SSI recipients. And all of those will be seeing in January in the payments and benefits they receive the increase at that time.
Thanks, Steve. The Social Security Administration has a nice fact sheet online, a 2-page or 3-page fact sheet, and they do give some examples of an average beneficiary. And so, and all retired workers, on average, again, the 5.9% increase would lead to an average benefit of $1,657, the $92 increase from last year or from the current year. But as Steve notes, that's an average. And so depending on what your benefit level is, don't go around thinking you might just get $92. You could get less, you could get more, depending on the base in which that's applied. I think it's also important to note, and this is maybe Chantal can move to you on this one, when thinking about the importance of the cost of living increase, because as you said, it's an adjustment based on prices, and it's to ensure that those who are on benefits, that their purchasing power isn't eroded over time. And one of the things that I think is often not mentioned enough about the Social Security cost of living adjustment is that they don't go down. So your benefits don't decrease. So, Steve had mentioned that the 5.9% increase is the largest one we've had in 29 years. Back in 2008, we had a 5.8% increase, and many people may remember gas prices going to $4 a gallon. We're sort of seeing similar things like that happen today. And the 2 years following that, there was zero COLA adjustment. And some people complained, wait a minute, where's my cost of living increase? But a cost of living increase can't go up until you have a higher amount than the preceding level. And so what's important for people to notice, to Steve's point, we don't know whether or not inflation will stay high, will drop down and have some inflation, stay flat, and maybe be deflation over time. But if there is deflation next year or even the next 2 years, the Social Security benefit level will not decrease. So people on benefits will get the benefit of that higher level, even if prices decline. And this is something you brought up about what's the accurate measure. So maybe we can have a quick discussion about what is in the CPI, like what is the basket of goods we're measuring, and does it appropriately and accurately measure what our beneficiaries need when it comes to their consumption basket? And should we look at changes? And I'll ask you first, Chantel, then ask Steve to weigh in as well.
Right. So what you're talking about, Jason, is that the Social Security program, the rules protect beneficiaries from, if there is deflation, seeing a cut to their benefit. They are held harmless. So if the COLA, if we see a negative, if we see a drop, actually beneficiaries' benefits then will just stay the same the following year. And I think Steve is probably in the best position to say whether or not we'll see a similar pattern to when that happened several years ago or not. I think it depends on how fast the adjustment is. We were certainly we're in a different context now economically than we were then. So I'll let him do the predicting there. But the important thing to know is that beneficiaries are protected from seeing a decline. They're also protected, if premiums for Medicare are deducted, there's an interaction there, and the increase cannot be more for lower income beneficiaries anyway than the amount of the COLA. So there's another protection built into the program there over time. And so in terms of there are debates about what is the proper measurement of inflation, and that sort of methodologically, when people talk about this chain CPI, they're talking about the way in which the index is actually calculated. It's a little bit different from the question I think you're asking, Jason, and that other people are asking as well, which is, how well does the CPI that's used to adjust benefits reflect the spending patterns of the Social Security population? And I think that, there is some indication that it's not a perfect fit, which is why folks, I think, have been interested in the CPI-E, the CPI for the elderly, which I think they define as 62 and over, but correct me, Steve, if I've got that wrong. And that's certainly an important part of the program, but it's not everybody who receives Social Security benefits. Children receive Social Security benefits. People with disabilities earlier in life receive Social Security benefits. But I think it's a question worth asking, and certainly I think that there probably is a measure that could be designed to fit it. And there we need to also think about, what are we trying to achieve? So are we, we're trying to protect the value of the benefit over time. And I think that is a really important, as I said before, feature of the program that needs to be preserved. And certainly when we think about proposals to make sure that Social Security remains solvent and on solid footing over time, that we want to make sure that we're keeping our eye on the ball in terms of those people who are receiving Social Security the longest, that the proposals don't inadvertently push more folks into poverty or diminish their ability to live independently and be economically stable. And so that's where we see, a big push to make sure we've got the indexing right, or to even provide a benefit boost for people who have been on the program the longest. And again, the benefit boost is something that is, it's better targeted than changing the measure of CPI for the whole program. You can actually help more people at a lower cost than changing the indexation. So I think we need to look at these proposals really carefully.
Steve, I mean, you've been working on this issue for a very, very long time. And I know there's been a lot of, as Chantal noted, a lot of debate, study, and research on what might be the best or most accurate measure of inflation when thinking about beneficiaries. And Chantal did a good point to mention it's not just retirees, there's those on SSI, there's the disabled community. What are your general thoughts? Do we have it basically right? The CPIE, which is an experimental, which basically looks at the elderly, tries to weight things more heavily in the basket, like potentially medications and healthcare, where the CPI that we use now might be more weighted towards energy, but it still does include healthcare costs. So what are your general thoughts? Do we have it right? Do we have it wrong? Do we need to look at it? What do you think?
Well, thanks, Jason and Chantal. Great points being raised. Let me first just address very, very quickly the idea of what happened back in 2008. When we last had a COLA at 5.8%, very similar to this. The thing you can look back, if you look at the CPI indices at that time, you'll see that while the third quarter of 2008 had this rather large increase in fuel prices that really created largely that 5.8% COLA, by December of that year, the prices had dropped back very substantially. And it was because of that, the drop back in the very same year by December, that we ended up having a much lower level of the CPI over the next couple of years than we had for the third quarter of 2008. Ergo, as Chantal well described, we did not have any COLA increases. Now, of course, the people who were first eligible for benefits in 2009, of course, did not receive that 5.8% COLA. So their first 2 years of benefit, they received no COLA. So there's a little bit of an issue that could be addressed differently here going on to the future. We do not anticipate that we will have that kind of drop by the end of this year or even into next year. I think our best expectation, what we hear from most economists, is an expectation that we might have somewhat of a give back in terms of the price levels by having not as much increase in certain areas that were elevated over the last several months, over the next 2 or 3 years, but not likely that we're going to have a dramatic correction down and therefore end up with no COLAs at all. We'll probably have COLAs, but they might be smaller than we would otherwise expect. So not really a major item there. So as to the other really interesting question about the index, I indicated initially that, of course, the CPIW for urban wage earners and clerical workers, these are based on the market basket purchases of people who are actually employed and working. There are 2 other indices. One is the CPIU for all urban consumers, which includes not only those workers, but in addition includes everybody else, including those who are 62 and over. As Chantal mentioned, the CPIE, which, by the way, BLS has stopped calling that experimental. Part of the reason, and you might want to see, by the way, up on our little website, we have a lot of material, much as Chantal was describing from Urban Institute, about analyzing different proposals. But we also have a 2013 little presentation that was made with AARP up there, if you want to look, describing some of the various different options for what a cost of living adjustment could be. Back at that time, the CPI was referred to as experimental because the share of all the people in the survey to cover all urban consumers that were 62 and over was relatively small, well below 20%. And therefore it was deemed experimental. As of this point in time, I believe we're now at the point where the share of people in the survey who are 62 and over is now at least as large, if not larger, than the share that are urban wage earners and clerical workers. So BLS has dropped the experimental notion on that. And as Jason mentioned, the CPIE for the elderly does in fact look different from urban wage earners and clerical workers, and for the urban and for all urban as a whole, largely because of medical. There's also some other factors like housing prices, but it's largely medical. So as a result, what happens historically is the CPIE tends to rise somewhat faster. We estimate on average it'll be about 0.2% faster. And this is indicative of what folks who are over 62, largely retired, and therefore out-of-pocket health expenses being older and retired tend to be larger than for the general population. One thing that people have noted is that while other Social Security beneficiaries, especially disabled beneficiaries, and disabled worker and their family beneficiaries are generally not over 62, they nonetheless are not employed and largely have higher medical expenses than average for their age. So it can be certainly argued that the nature of the market basket purchases for 62 and over may more closely align with at least our disabled worker beneficiaries than for the all urban or the urban wage earners and clerical workers. One other little comment about the chain weighted CPI, we like to call it the chain weighted. The chain weighted CPI actually is sort of interesting because we should all note that all of the CPI indices do reflect in them the opportunity for people to substitute buying Swiss cheese versus cheddar cheese, things that are really direct substitutes for each other. Changes that occur on that, which sometimes occur if, for instance, Swiss cheese goes up a lot in price and cheddar cheese doesn't. A lot of people might switch from buying so much Swiss cheese and instead they'll buy cheddar cheese. And that actually results in the current CPI indices, all of them, is somewhat slower rise because of people taking advantage of substitutes for some goods and services. Now, what the chain weighted CPI does is something very, very different. Chain weighted CPI looks at redistribution of purchases that occur. And by the way, the chain weighted CPI is only produced for the all urban, the CPIU. It looks at redistribution of purchases across categories that are not substitutes for each other. Like, for instance, if that new computer you were considering just went up a lot in price because of the cost of microchips, well, cars are maybe not a good example because they use a lot of microprocessors these days too. But your new Mercedes that you were thinking of getting, Jason, doesn't go up much in price. You might decide, being a man of means, to say, well, I'll buy that new Mercedes instead of the fancy new computer this year. However, while that really pertains to a large number of our population who have the liquidity to be able to make decisions about the kinds of purchases they want to make, many of our Social Security beneficiaries, and especially those in SSI, really are not operating in that environment. They're living more sort of close to the vest in terms of their purchases. So their ability to substitute, or should I say, to shift their purchases across non-substitutable goods and services is really not as great. So on that basis, some have questioned whether or not the chain weighted CPI would be appropriate, especially for SSI, but maybe even for Social Security. So again, lots of considerations here. One other thing I would mention too, Chantel, yes, we've been looking at these proposals for a long time now about the possibility of for people who would like to have an increased rate of change in benefits as people move in year after year after year after their initial eligibility, whether it be to move to the CPIE and have that be gradual, or whether after, say, 20 years of eligibility, have sort of a jump. Many considerations on that, clearly. If you have it done by the CPI and there is a gradual elevation, then people who may not survive for fully 20 years after initial eligibility will at least get something along the way. The other point, and I'm sure the urban material sort of represents this, is we tend to see in our older population that the older our population gets, the higher the percentage is that are people in poverty. And that might be counterintuitive because you might think, gee, death rates, of course, are higher for people with lower income. There's no question about that. On the other hand, many forms of retirement income are not, as I think Chantel indicated earlier, are not indexed by CPI or other means. Many private pensions and ways in which people actually disperse their own savings, they do that on sort of a linear basis without any attention to wanting to see those amounts increase over time. So Social Security is one of the few means that actually does have any indexation. So having increase at older and older ages has been seen to be sort of important, again, as Chantel well indicated. And we look forward to seeing from members of Congress what their further considerations are in this area going into the future.
Thanks, Steve. And I want to just sort of clarify one thing too, because this is where it gets kind of technical. You have the CPI, the chain CPI, the CPIE. Some have suggested a chain weighted CPIE to take in the substitution effects. If you go back over the last 20 years or so, it's not always that the CPIE is higher than the CPI. In a year or two, it might be lower. And so what we need to get across is, one, to Steve and Chantel's point, is because Social Security is an inflation protected program, it is generally speaking doing a very good job of protecting the purchasing power of those benefits. Is it perfect year after year? Perhaps not, but it is better than anything else that is out there. And that is the importance. And then to Chantel's point, maybe Chantel, you can speak a little bit about this, and I want to take some questions that we're getting from the audience. You know, you mentioned instead of maybe tinking around with the cost of living adjustment, which could be very costly, you can save money if you do a change CPI, but it could cost more money in the long run if you do a CPIE. That perhaps, and Steve touched this as well, you do some sort of bump up in later years. And perhaps this is a good time to talk about what that means. Would that be something where you say, for someone who's been on the program for 20 years, you get a bump up, or is it once you hit age 85, I'm just throwing out a number, you get an additional increase in benefits because that's when you might need it more because of healthcare? Can you explain to the audience what that is, and then we'll turn to some questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think you hit on two of the primary proposals that are kind of out there, Jason, that one would peg it to the number of years of benefit receipt, and others would peg it to a specific age. And, you know, I think one of the downsides there, of course, is there's a bit of a notch effect. And Steve was hinting at that, not just notch effect, meaning, you know, 1 year to the next effect, but also that with this, you know, adopting a more generous CPI, a more generous indexation measure would allow benefits to accrue to individuals over time. And if they don't, say, make it to 20 years of benefit receipt or age 85, that they've enjoyed some benefit. I think what's important here is, you know, as I think, you know, as Steve and Jason are well aware, having looked at, you know, hundreds of solvency plans, is that it's really important to look at these provisions, you know, together, and to understand, you know, how you're building a plan that has, you know, provision like this and what it interacts with other changes in the program, and what we're trying to achieve and who we're helping. And it really takes kind of a mix of changes. And so you could imagine that a Social Security plan could include something that, you know, wants to address the issue that Steve described of, you know, the oldest beneficiaries, those receiving benefits being the most vulnerable, that you include a benefit adjustment that would address that concern. But perhaps, you know, there are also others who say, well, Social Security benefits are not overly generous to begin with, and maybe, you know, maybe they would like to see more of a broad-based benefit increase, in which case that might push you to consider an indexation measure or policy over, let's say, a benefit boost. It really, you know, we need to look at these things in tandem. And again, if, you know, if one of your goals or one of your principles in shoring up Social Security is also to make sure that we've fully addressed poverty, or addressed as much as we can, that we're making sure that Social Security benefits are really providing protection for, you know, low wage workers, that, you know, you need a really well-designed minimum benefit, and that's going to help some of the same people. There are interaction effects between these proposals and these policies. And so what really interests me is that, you know, we want to evaluate these individually, but really we want to look at them together and look at the overall effect for the whole range, you know, the whole range of the beneficiary population and the needs. And what we see is that, you know, a lot of younger workers, unfortunately, you know, question whether Social Security is going to be there for them. Some even middle and higher income folks question the value of Social Security benefits, but they underestimate just how important they are, what a large share of their income Social Security is actually going to make up, even for very middle class workers. And so we need to take that into account as well when we're evaluating these provisions.
Chantel, thank you. I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. There are two technical ones, which I'm going to pass to Steve first. So Steve, some people have earnings and have then therefore have some of their Social Security benefits that are taxable. So the question is the taxable portion of Social Security benefit calculated before or after the Medicare premiums are deducted? I don't know, do you? Yeah.
Very, very good point. I believe we should check on this and get back. I believe that it is done on your basic Social Security benefit prior to any deductions for Medicare.
Okay, that was my thinking too. I wasn't sure, that's why I asked you.
Yeah.
The second one, and this is maybe you can explain how benefits work. So the question comes in, Steve, I understand that anyone who has reached age 62 but not yet claimed will also receive this year's COLA in the future. How does that work? So maybe you can talk about how the benefit formula is adjusted every year so that future beneficiaries are also getting the benefits of an accumulation of COLAs.
That's exactly right. So for anybody who will be eligible for a benefit as of December of this year, 2021, whether or not they have filed for a benefit and are receiving it as yet, but anybody who will be eligible for a benefit as of December of 2021 will have their benefit level adjusted by this 5.9% COLA. Now, if they happen to have turned 62 in 2021, but they haven't filed for their benefit yet, and they file for it in another 3 years, say when they turn 65, the benefit at that point will reflect the 5.9% COLA, and it will be with them for the rest of their life. It's really sort of a level shift. And in addition, if they wait 3 years to start receiving their benefits, any COLAs that occur over the next 2 years will, of course, add to that as well. So yes, the COLA applies to the benefit level that you are eligible to receive, whether or not you have started receiving it as yet.
Thank you. And then one last question for you, Stephen and Chantal, I'm coming to you. So our own Vice President, Bill Hoagland, and Budget Hawk heard you talking about the Trustees Report. And he said, can you clarify your comment on doing away with the budget scoring issue in the Trustees Report? What do you mean by that? He wanted some clarification.
Oh, Jason, you meant that for me? I thought you said Chantal.
Yeah, sorry, no, it's one more for you than to Chantal. But Bill Hoagland was asking, what did you mean by doing away with the budget scoring issue in the Trustees Report as a change?
Okay, so students of the Trustees Reports might have noted that for some years, I believe it's starting in 2014, there was some indication in the Social Security Trustees Report, as is also mentioned in the Medicare report, that Social Security draws from the trust funds have some implications for the unified budget and for the debt. In fact, the debt subject to limit, the debt ceiling, actually applies to the total federal debt, which is partly supported by Social Security trust fund investments. The point there really is that when Social Security, as it had been since after the 1983 amendments, is pulling in more money from revenues than it is spending, that money gets accumulated in the Social Security trust funds, and that money is all invested by law in interest-bearing securities backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, which actually is Treasury securities. So the implications of Social Security running surpluses, which it did for many, many years after 1983, is that Social Security actually invests in the general fund and actually supports, to a degree, the amount of debt that the rest of the government holds. And we should mention that Social Security, OESI, and DI trust funds cannot borrow. They have no borrowing authority. They must always maintain a positive balance. So many people have suggested that, and I won't name any names, but have suggested that if Social Security were to reach the point of trust fund reserve depletion, which we're projecting the OESI fund in 2033, that at that point, benefits might continue in whole under what we refer to as the budget scoring convention, and that the extra money needed beyond what would be available in the trust funds would come from the general fund of the Treasury, thereby putting pressure on the budget and creating extra borrowing from the public. In fact, that has never happened and cannot happen under law. So really, the thing that we really wanted to sort of make clear is that Social Security really operates as a trust fund entity. It does not draw from the general fund of the Treasury. It does loan money to the general fund of the Treasury and then redeem it as needed over time. But it is not able to increase the amount of debt that the federal budget has in general, or really affect on-budget operations. So there had been some indication of that, and you might see the actual opinion in the 2014 through 2020 Trustees Reports really addressed this. But I'm glad to say that the actual opinion in the 2021 Trustees Report no longer had a need to make mention of those aspects because the reference to budget scoring convention was removed from the 2021 OESDI Trustees Report.
I think that is important to point out that Social Security does not have its own borrowing authority, which is why it's very important that many of us keep talking about the need to do action sooner rather than later, because the longer you delay, the greater the delta is you have to change. And Chantel, I want to switch to you. Maybe you could give us a discussion. Let's move into sort of Social Security reform and a little discussion of the Trustees Report in the 15 minutes we have left. So someone asked, who in Congress on both sides of the aisle is currently leading any Social Security reform efforts? And what are some, I'll call them low-hanging fruits. Maybe nothing's a low-hanging fruit anymore politically, but when you start thinking about reforms, usually people put them in two buckets, right? There's the tax increases or the benefit changes, which could be reductions or increases. Are there any low-hanging fruits left? And again, in Congress, who's leading any sort of effort to, let's say, try to make the program solvent on both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I actually do think there is low-hanging fruit, and it's on what I think is the most important proposal that we need to have when we address Social Security, which is designing an actual robust minimum benefit. There's a lot of agreement on both sides that we could design a better minimum benefit for folks, and that is desirable, and it can be done in a way that is well targeted and efficient and affordable. And so, I've seen that included in a lot of bipartisan, in almost every bipartisan proposal, I believe. And, I think if you were to, a great resource, if you want to understand all of the recent proposals that have been put out, especially by members of Congress, is to actually go to the actuary's website. And, Steve and his colleagues have just a wonderful resource of all the proposals with detailed memos that provide estimates for every proposal that's introduced. And if you scroll through there, what you're going to see is that it's, the last several years, it's heavily weighted towards Democratic proposals. And I think that that's partly a reflection of how the dynamic around talking about Social Security solvency has shifted. So one of the reasons being that, people started to be more concerned about the adequacy of Social Security benefits, but also I think, former President Trump took a different stance on Social Security reform, and I think that impacted the ecosystem, especially on the right side in terms of putting forward specific proposals, because former President Trump took a different stance and sort of took it off the table in some ways for a while. And so I think we've seen what's been interesting and actually really exciting was that for the first time during the debates during the last election, we saw several really detailed proposals come from presidential candidates on Social Security. That is so unusual. And what's great about it is that, the more ideas that are put out there, the more we can evaluate them, right? And then the more we can learn about it and think more precisely about what we're trying to do, what we want to achieve, and the best way to put these together. And I think, the Bipartisan Policy Center's plan, Jason, you should jump in here and speak to the folks who have been working behind the scenes all these years on both sides, still thinking a lot about solvency. I'm sure there's a lot percolating on both sides, but we have these benchmark plans that come out every so often, and maybe we're due for another one soon to try an attempt to do bipartisanship. But I just want to come back to the minimum benefit again. I think that is the low-hanging fruit. That is the one thing that I think both sides have in common, and again, where we've done a lot, we've done so much work. We are better at designing those proposals than we were 5 or 10 years ago. And so that's really exciting. And that, Urban Institute and SSA have tools that can help us do better policy in this area.
If they want to fund us to do another retirement security commission, we'd be happy to do it. Steve, do you have any thoughts on this as well, low-hanging fruit, or who's sort of taking the lead, and the extent you can share, in Congress who's talking with you?
Well, thank you, Jason. And Chantel is exactly right that the minimum benefit consideration has really been a primary one that has seen a lot of bipartisan interest. And part of the reason for that, of course, is many are probably aware there is a special minimum benefit in the Social Security Act. The problem with that, though, is the parameters of that special minimum benefit are indexed only by COLAs over time, even across generations. And remember the way Social Security works, your basic benefit is determined at the point when you first become eligible. And from one generation to the next, the first eligible benefits go up with wage increases, which tend to be higher than the COLA. Well, as a result, what's happened with the special minimum benefit, it no longer is really applying to people who are newly becoming eligible for benefits. Ergo, as Chantel well mentions, the strong desire to possibly have something more of a special minimum benefit going forward, to at least update the special minimum that we had, or have something else. And most of the proposals have looked at having some percentage, whether it's 100% or 125% of the federal poverty line available to individuals who have worked at least 30 years of substantial work, and then maybe have it graded below that. There are many different flavors that, as Chantel indicated, we have a lot of those up on our webpage. The only other item I would mention that seems arguably possibly in the low-hanging fruit territory is the one proposal we've seen sort of with bipartisan support in slightly different flavors, which is the windfall elimination provision for individuals who have had years of non-covered earnings. And both Mr. Brady and Mr. Neal on the Ways and Means Committee have put forth proposals relatively recently on that particular item. Again, some interesting different aspects of the way they've looked at it. But what we have looked at, and I'm sure that Chantel and the folks at Urban have looked at it too, is I think, Chantel, you mentioned that Chairman Larson of the Ways and Means Subcommittee obviously has a bill out there, Social Security 2100. The most recent comprehensive bill we had, sort of the counterpart to that, was Sam Johnson back when he was in that same role. So we are much looking forward to seeing more proposals going forward in the future, keeping us busy.
And this might be a good point to segue a little bit into the trustees report in the last few minutes we have. So, Chantel, maybe you can start by telling us why many of us, Steve mentioned the windfall elimination provision, which is the WEP. I had a flashback to testifying from the point where I thought with Chairman Neal and Brady that we had a chance to actually get some changes done, and it just fell apart at the last minute. It's hard to do any sort of changes to Social Security politically. Part of that is there's misinformation being spread on both sides of the aisle, but maybe you could quickly explain to the audience, why is it important we do this now? And we've been saying do it now for 10 plus years. Why don't we just wait till the trust funds are depleted?
Yeah, I think we've talked about this often, and I have a thought exercise I'd love to ask Steve. But when we every year that passes, basically, and we get closer to the trust fund reserves not being available to continue financing benefits, we miss an opportunity to lower the cost of the changes needed to make the program solvent. And so what we're trading is either steeper tax increases or steeper benefit cuts, or a mix of the two. And so whichever one you think the solvency proposal, however you think it should be balanced, the math is worse with every year. And so we're missing an opportunity with the passage of time to either make benefits more equitable, more adequate, make sure that we're achieving the core principles of the program as it was designed to do, or also we're spreading the cost over a smaller pool of folks. And so that's really what's at stake here. And one thing I did want to mention, which we're talking about minimum benefit, and I don't want to lose sight of, is also the interaction with SSI, with the Supplemental Security Income Program, which is outside of the traditional solvency debate. But these populations overlap, and SSI is a program that protects a really a vulnerable population, folks with long-term disabilities and elderly, and a lot of children. And while the benefit is indexed, as Steve mentioned, there hasn't been an update to the basic benefit level in that program, or to many of the thresholds in the program, including how much someone is able to earn or to get from other sources of income, and parameters in the program that haven't been updated since the 70s or the 80s, or even since the program was created. And as a result, we're missing out on an opportunity to, again, address address poverty in amongst long-term disabled beneficiaries. And I think it's really important that that be considered in addition to solvency proposals and interactions with minimum benefits. And I know in the context of the reconciliation bill that's being debated right now, there's actually an opportunity to make small updates to SSI, and that is being considered and actively debated. These things are never cheap, but they're really important to consider.
Steve, maybe you could just, for the audience's benefit, if Congress continues to delay making changes to the solvency of Social Security and the trust funds are depleted, and again, we should point out, we didn't earlier, there are two separate trust funds that are legally separate, but conventionally we kind of talk about them together. But if we get to the 2030s, whether it's 2034 or 2035 or sooner or later, and Congress has done nothing and the trust funds are depleted, what might happen?
Very, very good question, Jason. And first, just a quick mention to what Chantel was talking about with SSI. The SSI federal benefit rate, of course, rises only with CPI. And I think to just augmenting the point that Chantel was making, that where Social Security benefits from one generation to the next increase with the average wage index, which tends to have real growth more than CPI, that has not been experienced for SSI. So we are seeing a number of proposals to give an extra boost, shall we say, over and above what has been just occurring from price increases for SSI. We sometimes look at that more as the general standard of living as opposed to what is oftentimes referred to as the cost of living. New goods and services come about from time to time. These are not really reflected as an increase in the CPI, but they are reflected an increase in what we are used to buying and our standard of living. So that's certainly something to consider. With respect to reserve depletion, Jason, and you know this, should we reach a point at any time when any of our trust funds have their reserves depleted, what that would mean is that Treasury and Social Security cannot pay out more than is available in the trust funds. So there would be a limit on the amount of money that could be paid out in full. Scheduled benefits could not be paid in full and timely. Now, understanding that, the Congress has never, I'm happy to say, in all the history of Social Security, ever allowed that to happen. So Congress has always stepped up in time to avoid any such drop off in the level of scheduled benefits from what has actually been scheduled. They sometimes have waited to, relatively close to the point of reserve depletion, as we've seen historically, but not. So the trustees have pointed out a number of times now that it would be desirable to enact changes for Social Security sooner rather than later for really three reasons. Well, one reason is to give people advance notice of what changes will be occurring. Second of all, it gives more options for things that might be considered to be made. And third, it allows for any changes that will be made to be done more gradually. However, really, we should note that over the next 75 years or over whatever period you're looking at, if we look at our current Trustees Report baseline, there's a certain amount of shortfall over the next 75 years. Over the next 75 years, that's the amount of shortfall that has to be fixed, either by lowering the scheduled benefits or by raising the amount of revenue. And of course, where you sit will determine how you feel about changing. For example, if we were to approach this by increasing tax rates in order to pay for Social Security more, somebody who is only going to be working for the next 10 years might say, well, wait, no, it's not favorable for me to raise the tax rate right away to help develop more funding for paying benefits in the future. It would be more favorable for me to wait until 2033 or 2034 to raise the tax rates then. So it's not really clear that raising the tax rates sooner or later makes an aggregate difference in the amount of extra revenue. In fact, it doesn't. The amount of extra revenue that we will need if we want to sustain exactly the current scheduled benefits through 2095 are what they are. And when we generate the extra revenue, will affect different people very differently, but in present value, the total amount of extra money we need is really the same. And similar with benefits. if to the extent that, as in the Bipartisan Policy Center's proposals and many others, we have a balance between increasing revenue and lowering our currently scheduled benefits. The question is, do you want to lower scheduled benefits for people who are in receipt of benefits right now, or wait for another 10 years or so? So these are all really choices that have to be made. But I guess the bottom line is really, we have a shortfall over the next 75 years. It is what it is. And again, the trustees, and I think we would probably all agree, those three factors that suggest at least enacting changes, even if they don't fully become effective until 2030, 2031, 2 or 3, enacting changes sooner rather than later would be good. More options, more advanced notice, and you can phase in the changes more gradually.
To end this, because we are at time. So one, I'm just going to point out, this has been a fantastic conversation. I wish we had another hour, because I have several thousand more questions on the trust fund financing and the trustees report on Social Security reform. But I think we did a really good job discussing the importance of the Social Security program and the importance of the cost of living adjustment, why it's important for beneficiaries, and what it means for people living on, the importance again of having that inflation protected benefit. I want to thank you both, Chantel and Steve, for participating today. I want to thank the audience for also listening in. I apologize we didn't get to everyone's question in the audience, and I wish again we had more time. And hopefully, come 2022, we'll be able to do this in person next. So with that, thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your day.